Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. Star Wars: The Last Jedi is frequently categorized as a subversion of myth, a film that intentionally strips away the grandeur of the Jedi legacy to reveal the frailty of its participants. Yet, to view the film primarily as a deconstruction is to ignore the precise, structural evolution it demands of its characters and its audience. The film serves as a rigorous investigation into the cost of institutionalized morality and the necessity of transitioning from a passive inheritance of history to the active creation of a personal truth. It posits that the true function of legend is not to provide a static moral compass, but to serve as a catalyst for individual failure, which in turn acts as the only viable path toward authentic wisdom. The narrative establishes this through a brutal confrontation between myth and reality. Luke Skywalker, once the embodiment of hope, is presented as an artifact of his own history, paralyzed by the gap between the monumental expectations placed upon him and the messy, human failure of his actual choices. The film refuses to treat his retirement as a narrative malfunction. Instead, it positions his isolation on Ahch-To as a necessary hermitage, a space where the grand, self-serving meta-narrative of the Jedi is allowed to wither. This shift is mirrored in the journey of Rey, who begins the film seeking a progenitor to define her worth. Her arc is not a search for power or lineage, but a painful maturation process, the realization that the universe does not provide answers through ancestry. Her eventual abandonment of the hope for a destiny tethered to a famous name represents the film's core ethical stance: morality is an act of creation, not an inherited trait. This philosophical rigor extends to the visual geography of the film, which frequently utilizes high-contrast environments to emphasize the friction between the ideal and the physical. The throne room of Snoke, characterized by its sterile, aggressive crimson, functions as the ultimate rejection of the hero's journey's archetype. It is here that the film definitively breaks the cycle of the apprentice-master dynamic. By placing the conflict between Kylo Ren and Rey in a space that strips away the trappings of spacefaring warfare in favor of an intimate, raw confrontation, the film forces its characters to confront the existential weight of their decisions. Kylo Ren's insistence that they let the past die is not the villainous credo it appears to be, but a radical, albeit distorted, attempt at escaping the deterministic loops that the galactic cycle of light and dark has imposed upon them. The film's technical execution supports this thematic focus on the weight of the individual. The use of scale, where characters are often framed against vast, indifferent landscapes or the overwhelming metallic geometry of the First Order, serves to minimize the individual's reliance on institutions. When the resistance is reduced to a handful of survivors trapped in a cave on Crait, the visual language pivots from the sprawling, cinematic scope of an interstellar conflict to the claustrophobic, tactile reality of human desperation. It is in this state of scarcity that the characters finally move beyond the performance of their roles. There is no longer a rebel alliance or a Jedi Order to provide the comfort of a grand cause, there is only the immediate, desperate decision to stand against tyranny. The film ultimately identifies the failure of the past not as a tragedy, but as the foundational element of the future. The inclusion of the children on Canto Bight at the film's conclusion provides the definitive synthesis of this argument. By showing that the capacity for rebellion and the potential for transcendence are not exclusive to those with specific bloodlines or training, the film democratizes the myth. It suggests that the Jedi, as an institution, were a closed loop, and that for the ideals they represented to survive, the institution itself had to become an open, accessible spark. The final image of the boy wielding a broom with the cadence of a lightsaber, gazing toward the stars, is the visual culmination of the thesis: history is not a burden to be upheld, but a fuel to be consumed by the next generation, who will define their own truths in the ashes of the old. The film succeeds because it treats the Star Wars mythos not as a sacred text to be preserved, but as a rigid structure that must be shattered to allow for the possibility of genuine, human growth. The subversion question. The Last Jedi is often viewed as a subversive deconstruction of legacy, yet this framing obscures the film's actual project, a rigorous, existential insistence on the democratization of power. The surface-level consensus posits that the film functions primarily as an exercise in overturning established law and challenging the mythos of the Jedi Order. However, this interpretation remains trapped in a reactive paradigm, ignoring that the film is fundamentally a narrative about the exhaustion of dynastic entitlement and the necessity of individual agency over institutional mandate. The film asserts that the vacuum left by the failures of the past is not a void to be mourned, but a vital space for the emergence of a new, unburdened consciousness. The central tension of the narrative is not found in the friction between the light and dark sides of the Force, but in the irreconcilable gap between historical narratives and lived reality. Luke Skywalker's initial refusal to participate in the conflict is not a character betrayal, but a logical confrontation with the unsustainable weight of the Jedi myth. By isolating himself on Ahch-To, Luke physically embodies the stagnation of an institutional legacy that has grown indistinguishable from the very darkness it seeks to combat. The film uses the architecture of the first Jedi Temple to visualize this calcification. The ancient, stone-hewn structures represent a stagnant truth that has lost its capacity to engage with the living world. Luke's arc is the violent dismantling of his own ego, transforming from a semi-divine, legendary figure into an honest, fallible human capable of failure. This shift in perspective is mirrored in the journey of Rey, whose arc serves as the most potent refutation of the consensus reading. While the audience is conditioned to look for a definitive lineage to explain her strength, the film pivots to an assertion of radical meritocracy. Her parentage, identified as nobodies, is not a denial of her significance, but an essential component of her sovereignty. By stripping away the comfort of a preordained destiny, the film forces the protagonist to define herself through her own moral choices rather than through the inheritance of ancestral power. This is the film's philosophical anchor. Power is not a commodity held by bloodlines, but a potentiality available to anyone with the resolve to claim it. The sociological structure of the First Order and the Resistance further reinforces this move toward decentralization. The First Order is presented as a sleek, hyper-industrialized bureaucracy, a machine that thrives on the total erasure of the individual in favor of standardized, fascistic compliance. In stark contrast, the Resistance, particularly through the lens of Finn and Rose Tico, undergoes a transformation from a traditional military outfit into an insurgency rooted in the empathy and lived experience of the marginalized. The Canto Bight sequence, often misinterpreted as a narrative digression, is actually the film's thematic crux. By exposing the callous, profiteering class that fuels both sides of the war, the film shifts the moral focus away from the epic clash of masters and toward the reality of those who suffer beneath the machinery of conflict. The revelation that the profiteers sell weapons to both sides renders the binary struggle between the First Order and the Resistance an illusion, demanding that the characters find a new vocabulary for resistance. Technically, the film's visual language supports this transition from the old to the new. The use of vibrant, aggressive colors, particularly the deep, bloody reds of Snoke's throne room and the salt-crusted, mineral-white plains of Crait, serves to strip away the murky, familiar aesthetic of earlier iterations. The throne room confrontation, in particular, functions as a visual pivot point where the artificiality of the Supreme Leader's power is physically destroyed. As the red curtains burn and the elite guards fall, the film abandons the aesthetic of inherited authority for the raw, kinetic reality of a present-tense struggle. The camera does not linger on the mythic scale of the combat, it focuses on the internal desperation and the immediate survival of the participants. By the film's conclusion, the transition is total. The final, lingering image of the child on Canto Bight clutching a broom as if it were a weapon is the definitive proof of the film's thesis. This is not a story about the restoration of a lost lineage or the perfection of an ancient institution, it is a story about the liberation of the idea of heroism from the constraints of history. The film ultimately argues that the past is a story we choose to tell ourselves, and that true power resides only in the agency we exercise in the present moment, independent of the names we carry or the labels we are given. It provides no sanctuary in nostalgia, insisting instead that the future must be built on the ruins of everything we thought we were required to preserve. The anomaly question. Star Wars: The Last Jedi functions as a radical deconstruction of the mythic hero's journey, positing that the true weight of legacy lies not in the inheritance of titles or bloodlines, but in the deliberate dismantling of the pedestal. The central anomaly that defines this friction is Luke Skywalker's initial refusal to accept the lightsaber offered by Rey. This moment is not a mere plot pivot, it is a profound rejection of the consumerist desire for easy nostalgia. By casting the saber aside, the film asserts that historical artifacts, and the ideological baggage they carry, are heavy burdens rather than inherent instruments of salvation. The film's thesis is built upon this act of iconoclasm. It argues that a movement, whether political or spiritual, attains legitimacy only when it sheds the calcified relics of the past to survive the vacuum of the present. The world of the First Order and the Resistance operates within a landscape of systemic exhaustion. The film visualizes this through the stark contrast between the sterile, monochrome corporate military architecture of the First Order and the rusted, scavenged reality of the Resistance fleet. The First Order represents the hyper-efficient, late-stage crystallization of power, where information is strictly controlled and dissent is treated as a mathematical error to be deleted. In contrast, the Resistance lives in a state of terminal precarity, inhabiting decaying cruisers that function more as mobile junkyards than strategic bastions. This scarcity dictates the character's psychological survival. When Poe Dameron attempts to maintain the hero narrative of the daring flyboy, he is met with the blunt reality of utilitarian loss. The film demands he reckon with the human cost of his performative bravery. His arc is a systematic stripping away of ego, moving him from an agent of chaotic kinetic energy to a grounded leader who understands that survival outweighs the glory of the strike. This shift mirrors the internal fracture of Kylo Ren, whose psychological state is defined by the desperate, often violent, attempt to sever his lineage. Ren represents the shadow of the hero, attempting to build a future through the total annihilation of his predecessors. His trajectory is consistently logical. He recognizes that the existing institutions, both the Jedi and the Sith, are failed structures that thrive on cycles of trauma and vengeance. His desire to let the past die is a cold, nihilistic observation of the same truth Luke discovers in his exile. However, the film differentiates their responses through the lens of empathy. Where Ren seeks to burn the world to erase his shame, the film proposes a synthesis, the preservation of the spark of hope without the institutional dogma that previously stifled it. The visual language of the film reinforces this philosophical movement. The cinematography utilizes high-contrast lighting, notably in the throne room sequence, to visually represent the internal struggle between the binary pools of light and dark. By emphasizing the emptiness of the massive, red-hued chamber, the film places the characters in a vacuum where their decisions are stripped of external cosmic judgment and returned to the individual. The use of practical effects blended with digital environments serves to ground the metaphysical stakes in a tactile, decaying reality. When the supremacy is cleaved in two, the VFX work does not merely sell a spectacle, it visualizes the collapse of the central command structure, leaving characters to navigate a literal fragmentation of their known world. Ultimately, the film concludes by redefining the nature of power in its universe. The final image of the stable boy wielding a broom, followed by his act of force-pulling, suggests that the Force is a decentralized, democratic power available to the marginalized rather than the elite. The film argues that the grand, mythic history of the Jedi was a self-aggrandizing structure that alienated the common individual. By bringing the Force down from the heavens and into the hands of the forgotten, the film finds its legacy. It leaves behind the exhaustion of the old world to embrace a future where the protagonist is not defined by who their parents were, but by the resolve they demonstrate in a moment of crisis. The narrative struggle is not the restoration of a lost golden age, but the construction of a new foundation upon the ruins of the old, proving that the most important act of a hero is the willingness to become obsolete so that the future might begin. The synthesis question. Star Wars: The Last Jedi functions as a rigorous deconstruction of the hagiographic myth-making inherent in legacy narratives, arguing that the true weight of heroism lies in the refusal to be consumed by the expectations of the past. While surface-level discourse often frames the film as a collision between established traditions and revisionist rebellion, the work is more accurately defined as an existential study on the necessity of failure in the maturation of a movement. The film dismantles the idealized, static icons of the Jedi and the rebellion to reveal the messy, human reality of resistance, asserting that the future of any ideology depends upon its ability to transcend its own foundational legends. The sociological environment of the film mirrors this collapse of grand narratives. The Resistance is not a sleek military machine, but a desperate, thinning line of people living in the rusted-out wreckage of a failing movement. The visual geography, defined by the stark, sterile white corridors of the First Order contrasted against the salt-crusted, decaying red and white terrain of Crait, articulates a world where the infrastructure of the old age is physically crumbling. The film utilizes this architectural decay to show that the structures of power and rebellion are equally unsustainable. By centering the story on the scarcity of resources, such as the desperate hunt for fuel, the film strips the characters of the ability to hide behind grand speeches, forcing them into the raw, unmediated consequences of their tactical and ethical failures. Psychologically, the characters are defined by the violent fracture of their internal metanarratives. Luke Skywalker's exile is the ultimate manifestation of this cognitive dissonance. He is a man trapped by his own myth, terrified that his failure to live up to the image of the perfect hero will inevitably poison those he intends to save. This trauma is physically localized in his lightsaber, a relic he treats with profound physical disgust, tossing it aside as a symbol of an ego-driven history that has only led to further suffering. Rey, conversely, experiences a different form of trauma, defined by the desperate desire to be a part of something that she can locate in an external legacy. Her journey is a forced shedding of these identity-affirming structures. She is compelled to recognize that her agency must exist independently of the bloodlines and names that others project onto her. Philosophically, the film positions itself as a rejection of deterministic cycles. The core ethical dilemma is the transition from a belief in preordained prophecy to the acceptance of individual accountability. Kylo Ren represents the extreme reaction to this transition, attempting to destroy the past entirely through a violent, nihilistic purging of all history. The film, however, counters his emptiness with the perspective of the noblest action, taking responsibility for one's own existence without relying on the comfort of established dogmas. This is the synthesis of the film's logic. True strength is found not in the preservation of the light or dark as rigid systems, but in the willingness to build an ethical path within the void left by their obsolescence. The craft choices serve as the visual proof of this thesis. The cinematography, particularly the hyper-focused, intimate shots of the Force connection sequences between Rey and Kylo, strips away the grandiosity of space battles to focus entirely on the microscopic shifts in character perception. The most poignant visual articulation of this theme occurs when the ancient, sacred Jedi tree, and the library of dogmatic texts contained within, is incinerated. This is not a moment of loss, but an act of liberation. The film's final shot, the young stable boy on Canto Bight gazing into the stars, cements the thesis: the myth of the Jedi has been successfully decoupled from the bloodline of the Skywalkers and returned to the reach of the common person. The cycle of historical baggage is severed, leaving the future to be written by the unburdened. By destroying its own institutional foundations, The Last Jedi proves that the only way for a narrative to survive is to stop being a sacred artifact and start being an active, evolving choice made by those who live in the present. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. Star Wars: The Last Jedi functions as a rigorous deconstruction of the mythic, positing that the galaxy's inherent fragility stems not from a lack of heroism, but from an obsessive, cyclical adherence to the institutional legacies of the Jedi and the Sith. The film moves beyond the binary of light and dark to explore how power is mediated through the control of history, the weaponization of conflict, and the exhaustion of systemic resources. By stripping away the ornamental sanctity of the Jedi Order, the film exposes the reality that institutional authority, whether spiritual or political, acts as a stagnant force that suppresses genuine individual evolution in favor of maintaining a comfortable, self-perpetuating status quo. The economic reality of the galaxy is defined by a ruthless, parasitic arms industry that thrives regardless of which political faction holds nominal control. On Canto Bight, this relationship is visualized through the opulent, frictionless spaces of the casino, where the elite extract capital from the systemic misery of war. The film makes it clear that the war between the First Order and the Resistance is a lucrative enterprise for those who sell ships and weapons to both sides, rendering the moral grandstanding of both factions functionally irrelevant. Labor in this society is commodified to the point of erasure. The children in the stables and the laborious in the shipyards represent a neglected underclass whose toil sustains the gleaming, high-tech aesthetics of the elite. This technological gatekeeping ensures that power remains concentrated in the hands of those who possess the hardware to impose their will, leaving those on the periphery to rely on scavenged, obsolete tools that keep them permanently trapped in a state of subsistence. Central to this breakdown is the epistemological failure of the characters who have built their identities around inherited labels. Luke Skywalker's isolation on Ahch-To is the physical manifestation of a man who has realized that his entire belief system served only to perpetuate a cycle of trauma rather than resolve it. His refusal to engage with the narrative of the legendary Jedi Master is an act of defiance against the weight of history that demands he become a predictable cog in a war machine. When Rey seeks out these ancient texts and icons, she is reaching for a framework that has already proven insufficient for her reality. The film argues that the reliance on these grand, static narratives prevents the characters from processing their own lived experiences, forcing them instead to perform roles dictated by past ghosts. The film's visual language reinforces this psychological fracturing. The vast, empty landscapes of Crait and the sterile, monochromatic command bridges of the First Order isolate the characters within systems they cannot control. The use of negative space in these environments emphasizes the insignificance of the individual against the crushing weight of systemic inertia. When the facade of their institutional identities begins to crack, the characters are forced into moments of radical vulnerability. Kylo Ren's rejection of his lineage and his subsequent attempt to burn down the structures that defined him is a brutal, albeit messy, pursuit of autonomy. He represents a desire to break the loop of the past, even if his methods are destructive. In these moments of collapse, the film finds its core, the recognition that meaningful change requires the total abandonment of the symbols and titles that have historically been used to justify the status quo. Ultimately, The Last Jedi suggests that the Jedi and the Sith are relics of a transactional worldview that views the Force as a resource to be harvested for political ends. The film asserts that true power resides in the ordinary, the ignored, and the unaligned. By the final act, the movement away from the institutionalized chosen one archetype toward the proliferation of the Force among the common people signals a shift in the film's moral focus. The conclusion is not found in the victory of one organization over another, but in the dissemination of hope as a decentralized, non-commodifiable force. The act of resistance becomes a personal reclamation of agency, a refusal to be defined by the wars of the past, and an acceptance that the future is built not on the inheritance of broken systems, but on the capacity of individuals to construct their own meaning in the wake of inevitable decay. Architecture and the visual geography. Star Wars, Episode VIII, The Last Jedi functions as a profound meditation on the necessity of dismantling inherited myths to forge a sustainable future. The film asserts that the veneration of the past, when maintained as an inflexible dogma, becomes an instrument of stagnation that suffocates the potential for genuine growth. By systematically stripping away the idealized iconography of the Jedi and the romanticized nature of the galactic struggle, the film pivots toward an existential realization: true power resides not in the preservation of ancient institutions, but in the internal evolution of the individual spirit. The visual geography of the film reinforces this thematic stripping of excess. On Ahch-To, the architectural hierarchy is inverted. There are no grand temples or sprawling, polished monuments to power. Instead, the setting is defined by rugged, primordial stone and weather-beaten dwellings that emphasize a raw, organic connection to the environment. Luke Skywalker lives in a space of self-imposed exile, characterized by a lack of artifice that mirrors his psychological rejection of his own legend. The production design deliberately contrasts this austerity with the clinical, high-contrast sterility of the First Order's flagship, the Supremacy. While the First Order occupies a space of hyper-industrialized, frictionless geometry, the protagonists are constantly forced to navigate the unpredictable, uneven terrain of the natural world. This distinction establishes a visual language where the modern power structure is depicted as a soul-crushing, synthetic imposition, while the hope for the future is found in the dirt, the tide, and the unrefined landscape. The film's approach to infrastructure serves as a visceral reminder of a golden age long since decayed. Crait, a mineral planet once utilized for mining, is rendered as a desolate wasteland defined by its stark white salt crust and the deep, crimson-stained earth beneath it. This visual palette functions as an externalization of the characters' internal states. The blood of the conflict literally stains the surface of their reality. The geography of navigation on Crait is one of frantic, desperate movement against a vast, indifferent canvas. The wide shots, utilizing deep compositing, dwarf the remnants of the Resistance fleet against the immense scale of the First Order's encroaching machinery. These visuals sell the profound insignificance of the individual against the systemic weight of authoritarianism, yet they simultaneously elevate the act of defiance. When the small, weathered skiffs trace lines across the salt, the film emphasizes that the courage of the individual, operating in the ruins of a collapsed order, is the only variable capable of disrupting the rigid machinery of the system. This focus on the individual is deepened by the film's exploration of the epistemic fracture. For Rey and Kylo Ren, the moment of truth arrives when the comforting narratives of their respective lineages are shattered. The film posits that personal identity cannot be predicated on one's ancestry or the adherence to external labels, but must be constructed through choice. The shadow here is not merely a dark reflection but an active temptation to retreat into the comfort of absolute belief. Kylo Ren represents the attempt to achieve power through the annihilation of the past, while Rey represents the struggle to move beyond the binary definitions of light and dark that have historically defined their reality. Their connection, mediated through the Force, acts as a psychological mirror, forcing them to confront the limitations of their own dogmas. The film's philosophical backbone is rooted in a rejection of determinism. The characters are constantly faced with the realization that the cycles of their world, the perpetual wars, the rise and fall of dynasties, are not inevitable laws of nature but patterns maintained by the living. By refusing to let the protagonist succumb to nihilism, the film champions a form of pragmatic existentialism. The final shots of the film, focusing on the common children of Canto Bight, suggest that the future of the galaxy does not belong to an elite bloodline, but to the collective potential of those previously excluded from the historical narrative. The broom-sweeping boy, gazing toward the stars with a flicker of Force sensitivity, acts as the ultimate affirmation of this thesis. It is a transition from the mythic, singular hero to the democratization of grace. The technical execution of the film supports this transition. The cinematography favors intimate, handheld camera movements during moments of internal conflict, drawing the audience into the character's immediate, frantic experience, while utilizing sweeping, majestic long shots to depict the grand scale of the theater of war. This contrast ensures that the viewer never loses sight of the human stakes embedded within the massive, VFX-heavy spectacle. The color science, moving from the muted, monochromatic blues of the island to the aggressive, jarring contrast of the red and white plains of Crait, functions as a sensory guide through the collapse of the old order. The Last Jedi ultimately presents a synthesis where the survival of the spirit is tied directly to the abandonment of the heroic facade. It argues that the most radical, heroic act is the acknowledgement of one's own failure and the subsequent decision to carry the spark of wisdom into an unscripted future. The legacy of the film rests on this deliberate destruction of the comfortable narrative. By the final frame, the characters are not saved by the past, but liberated from it. The film leaves the viewer not with the solace of a restored status quo, but with the bracing, necessary truth that the struggle to define reality is an ongoing, infinite responsibility. Epistemology, information, and society. Star Wars: The Last Jedi functions as a rigorous examination of how inherited narratives and systemic mythologies dictate the behavior of individuals within a crumbling galactic order. The film asserts that the primary struggle of its characters is not merely military, but epistemological. The galaxy operates on a consensus of history, a series of curated legends regarding Jedi heroism and Sith malevolence, that functions as an ideological state apparatus. This metanarrative is designed to stabilize the present by anchoring it to a glorified, often distorted, past. Characters like Luke Skywalker and Kylo Ren find themselves trapped within the suffocating weight of this history, forced to reconcile their lived reality with the hagiography of their predecessors. The film demonstrates that when a society relies exclusively on stagnant symbols, it suffers from a fatal starvation of context, leaving individuals to scramble for meaning amidst the noise of failing institutions. The ruling powers, represented by both the decaying resistance and the ascendant First Order, rely on specific propaganda engines to maintain the illusion of order. For the resistance, this takes the form of the heroic, singular Jedi myth. For the First Order, it is the spectacle of absolute authoritarian efficiency. In both instances, the truth is a casualty of utility. The film visualizes this struggle through the destruction of artifacts, such as the ancient Jedi texts or the throne room itself, which serve as physical anchors for these institutional lies. By dismantling these objects, the narrative forces characters to confront a post-truth existence where the absence of clear, objective history requires them to generate their own agency. Knowledge is presented as something earned through failure rather than inherited through bloodlines or holy texts, marking a departure from the reliance on canonical destiny. The architectural and social geography of the film reinforces this theme of exclusion and exile. Characters who exist outside the central conflict, such as those on Canto Bight, represent the forgotten populace, the outgroups who live in a state of hyper-capitalist distraction, indifferent to the shifting tides of the galactic war. Their existence serves as an indictment of the central players. The war is a privileged pursuit of elite families, while the rest of the galaxy continues to exist in a state of commodified apathy. By placing the narrative focus on these fringes, the film highlights how information is withheld or obscured from the public to preserve the status quo. The characters' journey is essentially a process of unlearning, as they realize that the data they have been fed is incomplete and designed to manufacture their consent for a cycle of perpetual, self-destructive violence. The film's visual language further emphasizes the collapse of these grand narratives through the deliberate destruction of pristine, polished spaces. The aesthetic of the First Order is one of sterile, sharp-edged uniformity, a machine of state power that demands absolute cognitive conformity from its subjects. In contrast, the reality of the survivors is messy, tactile, and fragmented. The film moves away from the frictionless, corporate transit of high-tier sci-fi to embrace the grit of a world in decline. As the characters navigate this decay, they are stripped of the comfort provided by their respective mythologies. The internal struggle for each protagonist, Rey's search for parental validation, Kylo Ren's attempt to destroy his predecessor's shadow, and Luke's retreat into isolation, is a microcosm of the galactic struggle to break free from a recursive loop of failed history. Ultimately, The Last Jedi posits that the only path toward genuine progress lies in the abandonment of these calcified systems of belief. The film rejects the notion that the future must be a reflection of the past. Instead, it places value on the subjective, embodied experience of the individual. The final image of the film, a young Force-sensitive child wielding a broomstick like a lightsaber, serves as the definitive synthesis of this argument. It demonstrates that the power to shape the future is not held by the gatekeepers of history or the masters of propaganda, but by those who exist on the margins, unburdened by the specific lies of the old guard. The film suggests that while systems of control will always attempt to codify the truth to maintain their hold, the inherent unpredictability of human experience ensures that these structures will inevitably succumb to their own obsolescence. The cycle of history is not an unbreakable chain, but a fragile construction that can be dismantled through the simple act of acknowledging the emptiness of the stories that hold it together. Friction, law, and the catalyst. Star Wars: The Last Jedi functions as a rigorous deconstruction of legacy, positing that the true weight of heroism lies in the abandonment of calcified mythologies to permit the birth of authentic, localized agency. While the popular discourse often frames the film as a collision between established law and modern revisionism, the text itself is an earnest meditation on the necessity of epistemic failure. The film argues that institutions, whether they be the dogmatic Jedi Order or the sprawling military hierarchies of the Resistance and First Order, survive only by commodifying the past, and that meaningful change requires the systematic destruction of these self-serving metanarratives. The sociological environment of the film is defined by a desperate, entropic decay. The state is no longer a coherent governing body but a parasitic extension of military-industrial reach. The First Order operates as an ultra-capitalist enterprise where existence is reduced to a ledger of resource extraction and strategic positioning. This is visualized through the sleek, sterile architecture of Snoke's throne room, which contrasts sharply with the salt-crusted, decaying relics of Crait. The ruling class maintains order through a rigid, high-tech monopoly on violence, while the rest of the galaxy, represented by the war profiteers on Canto Bight, exists in a state of frictionless indifference, moving effortlessly between selling weapons to both sides. Within this infrastructure, human life is treated as a disposable currency, a reality that renders the grand cosmic struggle for balance a hollow performance until the protagonists confront the vacuum left by their failing systems. The characters exist within an epistemic fracture, as every major figure finds their foundational understanding of the world violently dismantled. Luke Skywalker's withdrawal into isolation is a radical response to the realization that the Jedi Order's institutional history is a cycle of arrogance and failure. He possesses the vocabulary of a mythic hero but lacks the functional utility to address the present, leading him to treat his own past as a tomb rather than a guide. Rey, conversely, functions as an existential anomaly. Her struggle is not to uncover a predestined, noble lineage, but to accept that she is a blank slate in a world that demands she be a pawn in someone else's history. Her growth is marked by the shedding of the fabricated ego imposed upon her by the need for belonging, ultimately finding strength in the absence of a preordained pedigree. The film's philosophical backbone is rooted in a pragmatic rejection of dualistic moralism. The tension between Kylo Ren and Rey is the manifestation of two different responses to the burden of the past. Ren seeks to burn the entire system down to clear a path for his own unrestrained autonomy, while Rey initially seeks to fold herself into a pre-existing legacy. The resolution lies in the realization that the Force is not a proprietary tool of a sanctified elite but an ambient, democratic reality. By stripping away the religious trappings of the Jedi, the film shifts the focus from the preservation of order to the immediate ethics of compassion. When Luke creates the projection of himself to delay the First Order, he demonstrates a final, masterclass application of the means versus ends dilemma. He opts for a non-violent, symbolic gesture that saves the future while discarding the illusion of his own physical importance. Technically, the film utilizes high-contrast cinematography and deep, evocative negative space to reinforce this internal shift. The shift from the claustrophobic, red-drenched interior of the Supremacy to the blinding, expansive white salt plains of Crait serves as the ultimate visual metaphor for the death of the Old Guard. The VFX work prioritizes the physical weight of the environment. When the heavy, lumbering walkers stomp through the salt, they expose the red earth underneath, a visual motif for the bloody reality of conflict hidden beneath the surface of the clean military-industrial complex. The sound design follows this trajectory, transitioning from the rhythmic, mechanical thrum of the First Order's machinery to the sparse, haunting silence of the film's final movements, creating a sonic landscape where the characters are forced to finally listen to their own convictions. The synthesis of the film is found in the final, lingering image of the stable boy on Canto Bight. The film rejects the idea that change is a divine mandate granted to specific bloodlines or heroic archetypes. Instead, it posits that the future belongs to those who view the symbols of the past as nothing more than stories, using them as tools to spark a resistance that is rooted in the mundane realities of the present. The systemic collapse is not a tragedy to be averted but a prerequisite for the survival of the spirit. By the time the screen fades to black, the film has successfully argued that the only way to save a world in decay is to stop waiting for the past to arrive and start acting in the absolute, terrifying freedom of the present. The struggle is not in the victory of the light, but in the ongoing, imperfect process of continuing the work when the legends have proven to be insufficient. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. The psychological landscape of Star Wars, Episode VIII, The Last Jedi is defined by a rigorous process of deconstruction, where the characters are stripped of the comfort provided by their self-constructed myths. The film serves as an examination of the epistemic fracture, occurring most decisively during the revelation of the Hutt scene between Luke Skywalker and Kylo Ren. This moment represents the definitive shattering of Luke's long-held identity as the architect of a restored Jedi Order. When the facade of his legendary nobility collapses under the weight of his momentary impulse of fear, Luke undergoes a total transformation in his perception of reality. He retreats into a self-imposed exile, not merely out of shame, but because the truth of his failure renders his entire previous meta-narrative, the idea of himself as the savior hero of the galaxy, an existential falsehood. This crisis of self ripples through the ensemble, forcing characters to confront the discrepancy between their internal monologues and their performative speech. Rey, for instance, enters the narrative tethered to a fabricated ego that relies on the external validation of her parentage to define her worth. She arrives on Ahch-To with the silent, desperate hope that her identity is tied to an inherited legacy, a story that provides a clear trajectory for her existence. Her inability to voice this vulnerability until pressed by the darkness of the mirror cave reveals that she is effectively trapped by the restrictive language of hero mythology. She seeks a narrative where she is a protagonist in a pre-written play, and her trauma manifests as a persistent fear that she is, in fact, an orphan with no inherent purpose. The film forces her to abandon this linguistic crutch, demanding she define her value through her own present actions rather than the comfort of a bloodline. Kylo Ren operates through a similar mechanism of cognitive dissonance, though he employs it to anchor his violent shift toward authoritarianism. He constructs a narrative of liberation from the past, yet he remains deeply governed by his need for recognition from the very figures he claims to transcend. His actions against his masters and his kin are justified through a volatile internal logic that frames regicide as a necessary step toward total autonomy. He suppresses the somatic memory of his own familial connection, treating his body as an extension of his power rather than a vessel for his unresolved grief. By rejecting his lineage, he believes he is achieving a pure state of self-creation, but the film illustrates that he is merely repeating the patterns of the systems he claims to destroy. These characters are frequently confronted with the limits of their own language when attempting to bridge the gap between their trauma and their moral choices. Luke's retreat into the philosophy of letting the past die is a linguistic shield, a vocabulary of cynicism designed to prevent the recurrence of his foundational wound. He refuses to speak the language of hope because, in his epistemological framework, hope is the direct precursor to catastrophe. It is only when the mythic weight of his own history is finally lifted, symbolized by the destruction of the ancient Jedi texts, that he is able to reconcile his past self with his present duty. The film portrays this process not as a simple arc of redemption, but as a grueling labor of identity reconstruction. Each character is forced to acknowledge that their established view of the world is a mediated construct, and the path to authentic agency begins only when that fabrication is dismantled. Through this relentless interrogation of the self, the film posits that true conviction emerges not from the adherence to a grand, pre-existing narrative, but from the raw, painful reality of choosing one's own meaning in the face of uncertainty. Trauma and somatic experiencing. The trauma within The Last Jedi functions as a visceral, grounding force that dictates the internal lives of its protagonists, transforming the film into a profound study of somatic experience. For Luke Skywalker, the core wound is the catastrophic failure of his pedagogical mission, the moment he allowed his fear of Ben Solo's potential to manifest as an act of preemptive violence. This foundational betrayal of his own ideals is not merely a memory, it is a physical burden. Luke's self-imposed exile on Ahch-To is a manifestation of the body seeking to wall itself off from the history it has failed to reconcile. His physicality throughout the film is characterized by a heavy, deliberate lethargy, a somatic withdrawal that mirrors his mental dissociation from the Force and the galactic conflict. He treats his body as a reluctant vessel for a past he wishes to extinguish, and his eventual choice to project himself across the galaxy serves as the ultimate reclamation of his somatic agency, proving that his presence is felt most potently when he stops trying to hide from his trauma. Kylo Ren operates under a similar, albeit more volatile, somatic framework. His trauma is rooted in the perceived abandonment by his mentors and parents, a wound he externalizes through erratic displays of kinetic violence. His instability is consistently represented through the tactile, visceral sensation of his helmet. He destroys it in a moment of intense frustration, an act that signifies his refusal to be contained by the masks imposed upon him by Snoke. His body is a site of constant internal war, frequently filmed in states of agitation or physical exhaustion, reflecting a psyche that cannot find rest. The scar he carries is a permanent inscription of his failure to fully kill his past, a physical reminder that he remains tethered to the very attachments he claims to have severed. His dialogue often fails him, leaving his true intent to be communicated through the sharp, sudden violence of his lightsaber or the physical vulnerability of his exposed, raw grief when confronted with Rey. Rey's experience of trauma is fundamentally avoidant, anchored in the desperate, repetitive need to find a structural identity through parental validation. Her somatic memory is tied to the harsh, scavenging labor of Jakku, a lifestyle that has instilled in her a hypervigilance and a reflexive capacity for combat. She approaches her own physicality as a functional tool, upgradable, resilient, and constantly tested against her environment. Yet, her primary coping mechanism is the construction of a self-narrative built on the belief that her origins will define her value. When she encounters the dark side cave, the film forces her into a confrontation with the emptiness of that narrative. She is literally and figuratively confronted with a reflection of her own isolation, a moment where the internal void becomes a visual landscape. The interplay between these characters reveals that their trauma is not a static background element but a driving force that informs every tactical and moral choice. They are trapped in cycles of repetition compulsion. Kylo Ren attempts to kill his past to gain control, while Luke attempts to erase his legacy to protect the future. These defensive reactions are deeply somatic, manifesting as the tension in Luke's shoulders, the frantic pacing of Rey, and the explosive, sudden outbursts of Kylo Ren. The film argues that true resolution of trauma occurs only when these characters stop attempting to externalize or deny their wounds. When they eventually accept their histories, not by dwelling in them, but by allowing them to inform their present actions, the physical weight they carry begins to shift. Through this lens, the film posits that the body is the final arbiter of truth. While the mind may craft elaborate lies or defensive barriers, the physical presence of the characters, their exhaustion, their scars, and their movements, remain the most honest indicators of their evolving psychological realities. The struggle for self-actualization in The Last Jedi is ultimately a physical process, requiring the characters to inhabit their own histories with total, unflinching honesty. The Shadow and the Antagonist. The Last Jedi operates as a profound psychological autopsy, using the dynamic between Rey and Kylo Ren to map the internal friction between identity and inherited legacy. Kylo Ren functions as the Jungian shadow of the protagonist, embodying the visceral, unrefined volatility that Rey suppresses beneath her disciplined search for belonging. While Rey seeks to anchor her sense of self in the validation of external archetypes, the master, the father, the hero, Kylo Ren pursues an aggressive deconstruction of those very same structures. His logic is rooted in a pragmatic, albeit ruthless, assessment of the past. From his epistemological vantage point, the cyclical failures of the Jedi and Sith are not merely tragic, they are systemic inefficiencies that necessitate a total erasure of historical precedent. By demanding that Rey abandon her attachment to the icons of the past, Kylo Ren acts as a catalyst for her forced individuation. The film orchestrates a mirror dynamic through the parallel experiences of these two characters, each tasked with navigating the ruin of their respective ideological foundations. Both are orphans of a sort, defined by the abandonment of their mentors, yet they diverge fundamentally in their response to that isolation. Where Rey projects her own desperate need for moral stability onto the reluctant Luke Skywalker, Kylo Ren projects his hatred of perceived weakness onto the apparatus of the First Order. This is not a relationship of binary opposition but one of symbiotic necessity. They feed off each other's emotional capital, recognizing in the other the only person capable of acknowledging their authentic, unmasked reality. The tension within this bond is sustained by the characters' shared burden of choice. Rey is terrified that her internal darkness mirrors the potential for cruelty she sees in Kylo, while Kylo is tortured by the lingering pull of the compassion he views as a vestigial, obstructive emotion. The film posits that their mutual obsession is a result of this recognition. Each sees the other as a potential vessel for the future they hope to claim. Rey uses her connection to Kylo as a mirror to test the limits of her own righteousness, while Kylo uses Rey to validate his rejection of the past. Their interaction forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that neither the light nor the dark, as traditionally defined, offers a complete framework for existence. Furthermore, the film utilizes this interplay to examine the fragility of the ego. Characters frequently struggle with the disparity between their public performance of heroism or villainy and their private, fractured experiences. When the facade of the legendary Jedi collapses, Luke Skywalker retreats into a self-imposed exile, a choice that mirrors the internal withdrawal of a traumatized psyche. Rey, by contrast, must integrate the volatility of her own nature with the demands of the struggle. The antagonist's perspective serves as a necessary disruption to the comfortable narratives that define the protagonist's beginning, pushing her toward a reality where morality is not a received inheritance, but an active, moment-to-moment construction. By positioning the antagonist as a logical, albeit extreme, pragmatist, the film avoids the comfort of a simple moral victory, ensuring that the characters, and the audience, must grapple with the inherent messiness of individual agency. Ultimately, the film treats the shadow not as an entity to be defeated, but as an inextricable part of the self that must be acknowledged to achieve true autonomy. The psychological evolution of the characters is thus inextricably linked to their ability to survive the disintegration of the metanarratives they once clung to, leaving them in a state of existential freedom that is as terrifying as it is transformative. The visual proof of the psyche. Star Wars: The Last Jedi functions as an expansive interrogation of the psychological weight inherent in myth-making. The film posits that the internal reality of an individual is fundamentally shaped by the legends they inherit, and that trauma arises when those inherited narratives fail to account for the complexities of the human condition. While the series is often viewed as a cyclical battle between light and dark, this entry argues that the true struggle resides within the epistemic fracture, the moment a character recognizes that their guiding beliefs are constructed, fragile, and ultimately insufficient for the current moment. The architecture of the film serves as a primary tool for mapping this internal collapse. Characters are repeatedly placed in environments that physically externalize their state of exile. Luke Skywalker, sequestered on Ahch-To, is framed against vast, indifferent landscapes that emphasize his self-imposed abandonment of the galaxy. The camera work here is observational and still, forcing the audience to occupy the same suffocating isolation that defines Luke's survivalist psychology. When Rey attempts to bridge the distance between herself and Luke, the film utilizes deep focus and expansive framing to showcase the physical impossibility of their connection, highlighting that their conflict is one of competing ontologies rather than mere geography. This psychological depth extends to the film's handling of the antagonist. Kylo Ren acts as the physical manifestation of a repressed, fractured self. His trajectory is a study in the volatility of performative power, as he struggles to reconcile his heritage with his desire to forge a new reality. The film presents his violence not merely as an act of conquest but as a desperate attempt to solidify an identity built on the ruins of the past. The visual motifs associated with his journey, the stark, clinical interiors of the First Order ships contrasted with the organic, raw energy of his own instability, demonstrate a character operating under the weight of a pre-programmed destiny he both craves and despises. The film's brilliance lies in its commitment to the somatic experience of trauma. Characters carry their pasts as physical burdens, they flinch, hesitate, and oscillate between cold detachment and outbursts of raw, unfiltered emotion. The lightsaber, an iconic symbol of power within the franchise, is here repurposed as an instrument of psychological stress. When the weapon is destroyed, the visual impact is jarring not because of the loss of a tool, but because it represents the disintegration of the mythic ego that the characters have constructed around themselves. In that moment of destruction, the film forces a departure from the grand narratives of the past, requiring the protagonists to define themselves without the crutch of inherited symbolism. The technical execution reinforces this shift. The use of lighting is purposefully varied to reflect internal shifts. The sterile, monochromatic tones of the supremacist's interior suggest a society that has perfected the art of suppressing individuality, while the warm, chaotic hues of the Crait battlefield evoke a visceral return to reality. The integration of practical sets and digital extensions is seamless, ensuring that the environmental vastness never diminishes the intimacy of the character beats. The sound design, particularly the moments of absolute, jarring silence, serves to emphasize that the true resolution of the film's conflicts happens internally, away from the noise of space warfare. Ultimately, The Last Jedi is a profound meditation on the necessity of shedding the past to embrace a present that lacks a clear, predefined moral roadmap. By stripping away the performative layers of hero worship and institutional certainty, the film arrives at a conclusion defined by existential agency. The final imagery of the film, the child on Canto Bight grasping a broom as if it were a weapon of destiny, serves as a testament to the idea that the power to act is not reserved for the chosen, but for those capable of constructing their own purpose from the wreckage of their history. The film leaves the viewer not with the comfort of a restored status quo, but with the demanding, open-ended potential of a world that must now define itself anew, through the choices of the living rather than the ghosts of the dead. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. Star Wars: The Last Jedi functions as a rigorous investigation into the collapse of established narratives and the necessity of forging individual meaning in a vacuum of institutional authority. At its core, the film posits that the grand, binary myths governing the galaxy, the rigid dichotomy of Jedi and Sith, the inevitability of bloodlines, and the sanctity of ancient texts, are linguistic traps that stifle growth and maintain static cycles of violence. By systematically dismantling these pillars, the narrative forces its characters into a post-truth landscape where they must confront the terrifying absence of an external arbiter of moral law. The film's epistemological framework is defined by the failure of inherited language. Luke Skywalker lives in self-imposed exile, not merely because of personal failure, but because he recognizes that the vocabulary of the Jedi Order serves only to perpetuate the very destruction it purports to prevent. When Rey presents the Jedi texts, Luke views them as historical artifacts of a failed dogma rather than sacred manuals of objective truth. His rejection of these texts reflects a Wittgensteinian shift. He realizes that the limits of his world are dictated by the restrictive, binary terminology of his order. By choosing to burn the library, the film asserts that truth is not a static relic to be guarded by a priestly class but an evolving, lived experience that demands the abandonment of institutionalized discourse. This erosion of authority extends to the film's representation of political and military reality. The conflict between the Resistance and the First Order is no longer a struggle between clearly defined archetypes, it is a chaotic environment where information is weaponized and distorted. The film emphasizes that reality is mediated by the narratives the powerful construct to maintain their grip on the collective consciousness. Supreme Leader Snoke exerts his will by projecting a false, gargantuan version of himself, a visual metaphor for the propaganda machine that sustains his tyranny. Conversely, the film exposes the fragility of the Resistance's reliance on the myth of the hero as a savior. When the characters finally act, their success depends on rejecting the comfort of these myths and embracing the messy, localized reality of their immediate circumstances. The philosophical weight of the film relies on the tension between deterministic destiny and the burden of autonomous choice. Characters like Kylo Ren operate under the belief that they are fulfilling a preordained role within a cosmic script, using the shadow of their ancestry to justify their present brutality. The film challenges this fatalism by presenting the Force as a living, neutral medium that refuses to endorse one side of a binary conflict. There is no ultimate arbiter in this universe. The Jedi and Sith are merely labels applied to a raw, natural power. The film argues that individuals possess the agency to detach themselves from these labels, effectively choosing to exist outside the historical machinery of the galaxy. This transition from cradle-to-grave ideological inheritance to radical self-definition creates a profound sense of existential vertigo for the characters, who find themselves stripped of the moral safety nets that previously guided their decisions. Visually, this epistemological shift is mirrored through the film's treatment of light and space. The use of high-contrast, minimalist environments, the stark white salt of Crait, the red-hued interior of the throne room, serves to isolate the characters, forcing them to exist in the now rather than the always of historical precedent. The camera rarely hides behind the grand scale of epic exposition, instead, it lingers on the uncomfortable silence and the vulnerability of the human psyche when stripped of its uniform and titles. The throne room confrontation, in particular, serves as a masterclass in the rejection of binary resolution. By destroying the ultimate source of both the light and the dark, Snoke and his artificial hierarchy, the film clears the stage for a new, unscripted reality. Ultimately, The Last Jedi operates as an argument for the necessity of the absurd revolt. Confronted with the failure of the old world's grand narratives, characters like Rey and Finn find meaning not through the reclamation of past glory, but through the humble, often invisible labor of protecting the future. The film concludes by signaling that the truth of the galaxy is no longer found in the proclamations of a Senate or the decrees of a Force-sensitive elite, but in the potential of the individual to act with purpose in the absence of a mandate. It is a work that champions the democratization of the spirit, asserting that while history is a powerful narrative tool, it is not a cage. By the final frame, the film has successfully deconstructed the inherited mythologies of its franchise to reveal a blank, hopeful slate, where the future is determined by the clarity of the present rather than the echoes of the past. Meta-narratives and social theory. The Last Jedi functions as a deliberate dismantling of the hagiographic myths that sustain the Star Wars universe, positing that the collapse of these grand narratives is a necessary prerequisite for genuine agency. The film operates on the premise that the legacy of the Jedi and the binary struggle of the Force have become stagnant icons, hollowed-out symbols that dictate behavior rather than inspire wisdom. By stripping away the reverent veneer of the past, the film forces its characters to confront an existential reality where preordained destinies no longer provide a safety net, compelling them to synthesize their own meaning from the wreckage of failed institutions. This collapse is most acutely realized in Luke Skywalker, who has become an exile from his own legend. He recognizes that the Jedi Order, as an ideological state apparatus, maintained order through the curation of its own history, effectively suppressing the reality that the light side is inextricably linked to the darkness it claims to oppose. Luke's retreat to Ahch-To serves as a rejection of this circular logic. He understands that the perpetuation of the Jedi mythos creates a self-correcting feedback loop. Every attempt to restore the balance only invites a new manifestation of the shadow. His refusal to participate in the narrative arc expected of a legendary hero is an act of radical honesty, an acknowledgement that the symbols of the past are merely artifacts, insufficient for the complexities of the present. The film extends this critique into the broader conflict between the First Order and the Resistance, characterizing the war as a lucrative cycle of consumption. The Canto Bight sequence exposes the reality that the galaxy's arms trade thrives on the parity of these warring ideologies. The both sides paradigm acts as a mechanism of control, where the conflict itself is the product. The commodification of rebellion, as seen in the trade of weaponry to both fascists and freedom fighters, demonstrates that the state apparatus is not confined to military dominance but is embedded within the very economy of the conflict. Characters like DJ serve as the logical extreme of this realization, operating outside the moral binary because they have identified that the conflict is merely a performance designed to generate capital for the detached elite. Rey's arc serves as the bridge between the exhaustion of these old narratives and the necessity of forging a new identity. Her obsession with finding a place within the existing mythos, specifically, her desperate search for a heroic lineage, is a search for validation within a system that has already proven its obsolescence. When Kylo Ren urges her to let the past die, he is articulating a nihilistic interpretation of the same truth that Luke reaches through his isolation. The film asserts that while the past informs the present, it cannot act as a mandate for the future. Rey's ultimate evolution occurs when she accepts that she is not a pawn of a grand, ancestral design but an individual capable of defining her own ethical parameters. The visual language of the film reinforces this shift, favoring organic decay and harsh, elemental landscapes over the sterile, high-tech environments of the previous eras. The throne room of Snoke, characterized by its aggressive, artificial crimson, stands as a monument to the theatricality of power, a place where reality is curated for the consumption of those who believe they command it. In contrast, the salt flats of Crait reveal the underlying reality of the conflict, raw, abrasive, and indifferent to the legacy of the combatants. The visual juxtaposition of the brilliant red earth beneath the white surface serves as a metaphor for the thin, fragile layer of propaganda that covers the brutal truth of the struggle. By the film's conclusion, the transition is complete. The destruction of the ancient Jedi texts does not represent the end of the Force, but the liberation of its utility from the confines of dogma. The final image of the young boy on Canto Bight clutching a broom as if it were a lightsaber symbolizes the democratization of the myth. The grand narrative has been stripped of its exclusionary, aristocratic, and bloodline-heavy requirements. The system of institutionalized belief has fallen, but in its place stands an individual capacity for hope that is no longer shackled to the failures of the past. The film asserts that the cessation of the old, recursive cycle is the only path toward a genuinely transformative future, where agency is earned through the act of living rather than inherited through the weight of history. Ethics and the moral calculus. Star Wars: The Last Jedi functions as a rigorous inquiry into the moral calculus of conflict, dismantling the comfort of binary heroics to examine the heavy, often brutal, weight of consequence. The film situates itself within an ethical framework that demands its protagonists move beyond idealistic adherence to institutional dogma, forcing them into a state of Camusian absurdism. By stripping away the protective layer of historical mythology, the narrative compels characters like Luke Skywalker, Rey, and Poe Dameron to confront a universe that is fundamentally indifferent to their legacies, ultimately requiring them to construct meaning through active, immediate participation in the present moment rather than reliance on preordained narratives. The core ethical dilemma of the film is a recursive application of the trolley problem, where the stakes are elevated from individual survival to the existential preservation of a movement. Poe Dameron begins the film tethered to a rigid, deontological perspective, believing that the moral necessity of a victory justifies any expenditure of assets and lives. He perceives his actions through the lens of a classic, heroic archetype where the intent of the hero serves as the ultimate moral justification. In contrast, Vice Admiral Holdo embodies a cold, utilitarian calculus. Her decision to withhold information is grounded in the necessity of organizational security and the preservation of the many at the expense of the trust and comfort of the few. The film refuses to offer a simple verdict on these approaches. Instead, it presents the friction between them as the primary catalyst for the destruction of the Resistance's infrastructure. The resolution of this tension is found not in the victory of one philosophy over the other, but in the realization that leadership requires the integration of bold action with a sober, lived understanding of the cost of that action. This philosophical evolution is mirrored in the relationship between Rey and Kylo Ren, which interrogates the threshold of personhood and the boundaries of moral culpability. Kylo Ren represents the rejection of the past, a scorched earth approach to history that seeks to achieve liberation through the annihilation of all preceding systems. He perceives his violence as a cleansing act, a way to reach a state of absolute autonomy. Rey, however, undergoes an epistemic shift when she realizes that her origins are not the source of her moral authority. By detaching her identity from the grand, inherited narratives of the Jedi and the Sith, she achieves a form of personhood defined solely by her choices. The film posits that moral rights are not earned through bloodlines or alignment with ancient institutions, but are asserted through the conscious decision to act with empathy in an increasingly chaotic, post-truth environment. Luke Skywalker provides the most profound study in the ethics of ignorance versus the burden of the truth. His retreat to Ahch-To is a self-imposed exile rooted in the belief that the Jedi Order's existence is an inherent perpetuator of darkness. He views the history of the light side as a cycle of inevitable failure, a systemic flaw that makes ignorance, specifically, the cessation of his own influence, the most ethical path. When he eventually emerges, he does not do so to re-establish the old order, but to provide an act of theater, a symbolic, non-violent projection that serves as an inspiration rather than a tactical solution. This is the ultimate expression of an absurd revolt. Knowing his physical intervention is inconsequential to the overwhelming military might of the First Order, he chooses to create a beacon of hope that fundamentally alters the perception of the galaxy. He abandons the pursuit of victory for the pursuit of meaning. The film continuously probes the convergence of the protagonist's and antagonist's methods, specifically regarding the utilization of force to reshape reality. Both Rey and Kylo Ren desire to see the galaxy liberated from the constraints of its previous cycles, yet they are separated by their willingness to maintain the integrity of others' lives. The ideological divide is not found in their respective goals, but in their capacity for connection. Kylo Ren's pursuit of the end state necessitates the destruction of the other, while Rey's moral development is predicated on the integration of the other. The film demonstrates that the moral difference between the two is found in their relationship to the community. Kylo seeks to rule over a vacuum of his own making, while Rey fights to preserve the possibility of a collective future. Ultimately, The Last Jedi argues that in a world where grand narratives have failed, the only valid moral anchor is the commitment to a shared, vulnerable humanity. The struggle itself, stripped of the veneer of destiny or divine favor, becomes the only objective reality left to define. Determinism, agency, and time. The Last Jedi presents an intricate examination of the tension between historical determinism and the radical assertion of individual agency. The film posits that the primary conflict for its characters is not found in external battles between opposing factions, but in the psychological struggle to detach from the weight of legacy. This tension manifests through a rejection of cyclical time, the idea that events are destined to repeat, in favor of a spontaneous, present-oriented ethics. By dismantling the structures of the past, the film argues that the individual attains true freedom only when they accept that they are not a product of their lineage or a servant to the historical scripts imposed upon them. The narrative functions as an autopsy of the chosen one trope, illustrating how such grand, deterministic labels serve as tools of structural control. Luke Skywalker's initial withdrawal to Ahch-To represents a profound reaction to the burden of this narrative, where he concludes that the cycle of light and dark is an inevitable mechanism that necessitates his own absence. He views his history, and the history of the Jedi Order, as a fixed loop that traps subsequent generations in the same fatal mistakes. The film challenges this deterministic outlook by positioning the emergence of Rey and Kylo Ren not as iterations of past archetypes, but as authentic disruptors. Their agency is predicated on their willingness to shatter the symbols of the past, exemplified by the destruction of the sacred texts and the internal collapse of the Skywalker mythos. The film's exploration of agency is further articulated through the lens of failure. Unlike traditional heroic journeys that rely on the perfection of the protagonist, The Last Jedi asserts that growth is derived from the wreckage of past expectations. The characters are tasked with navigating a world where the structures of authority have decayed into useless, performative relics. When Kylo Ren commands Rey to let the past die, he is expressing a nihilistic version of this truth, one that seeks to erase history to create a void for his own ambition. Conversely, Rey's journey centers on the realization that her value is not inherited from her ancestry, a deterministic trap designed to define her worth, but earned through her choice to align with the needs of the living. This distinction is the film's moral heartbeat. Agency is not the power to fulfill a destiny, but the power to discard one. The visual language of the film reinforces this struggle against determinism. The stark, high-contrast environments, the crystalline white and deep red of Crait, the cavernous, timeless silence of the Jedi library, dramatize the conflict between old-world rigidity and the fluid, unpredictable nature of the present moment. The cinematography consistently frames characters against massive, ancient, or systemic backdrops that emphasize their potential insignificance, only to then focus on the intimate, often messy, micro-decisions they make in isolation. This spatial psychology forces the viewer to confront the burden of choice. When the characters are stripped of their institutional supports, they are left in a state of existential vertigo. It is in this void that the film finds its thesis. The absence of a predetermined path is not an invitation to despair, but the only possible condition for genuine moral growth. Ultimately, the film posits that existence is defined by the struggle itself rather than the resolution of a binary conflict. The final imagery of the broom boy reaching for the stars serves as a powerful testament to the democratization of agency. This character possesses no inherited legacy and operates entirely outside the established power structures of the Jedi or the First Order. His act of defiance signifies that the Force, here serving as a metaphor for the potential for change, is not a proprietary asset of a bloodline or an institution. It is a capacity available to any individual who chooses to act in the face of an indifferent universe. By rejecting the cyclical nature of history, The Last Jedi creates a future where the individual is the sole author of their meaning, proving that the system is only as powerful as the belief we invest in its permanence. The film leaves the audience with the understanding that while history may attempt to dictate the present, it is the refusal to be bound by those scripts that allows for the creation of something authentically new. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The visual language of The Last Jedi serves as a deliberate instrument for deconstructing the mythic weight of its own franchise history, utilizing a sophisticated interplay of framing, color, and camera movement to prioritize individual interiority over the rigid iconography of the past. The cinematography establishes a persistent visual hierarchy that shifts fluidly between the monumental and the intimate. By favoring fluid, sweeping camera movements, the film positions the lens as an active, sentient observer rather than a detached recording device. This technical choice allows the audience to feel the tactile presence of the environments, the salt-crusted plains of Crait, the humid, rain-slicked cliffs of Ahch-To, and the austere, clinical interiors of the First Order fleet. The camera glides with a deliberate, graceful precision, effectively mimicking the emotional weight of characters who are in the process of shedding their projected destinies. The film's color palette architecture is essential to its thematic exploration of balance and disillusionment. Throughout the production, specific chromatic shifts signal the psychological evolution of the protagonists. The cold, sterile grays and sharp, aggressive reds of the Supreme Leader's throne room create a visual atmosphere of suffocating ideological power, where the sharpness of the red backdrop serves to isolate the characters against a void of absolute authority. In contrast, the sequences on Ahch-To employ a desaturated, earthy palette that reflects a world stripped of romanticized heroism, forcing the characters to contend with the raw, unadorned reality of their existence. When these worlds collide, the infusion of intense color acts as a physical manifestation of internal transformation, signaling the moment a character stops performing their legacy and begins to define their own autonomy. Depth and negative space are leveraged to emphasize the existential state of the characters. By utilizing wide-angle lenses to place figures within vast, indifferent landscapes, the film forces an acknowledgement of the character's individual insignificance against the scale of history. When characters are framed against expansive, empty horizons, the sense of dread is replaced by a profound, lonely freedom. The use of depth is particularly effective in scenes of isolation, where the distance between characters is visually elongated to emphasize the breakdown of communication. Even when individuals occupy the same space, the framing keeps them physically and emotionally distinct, preventing the easy, harmonious resolutions that characterized the older, more binary visual language of the series. The motif of light functions as the film's most potent narrative device. Rather than utilizing light as a mere source of illumination, the cinematography treats it as a shifting truth. High-contrast lighting patterns are employed during moments of confrontation to split faces into shadow and highlight, reinforcing the internal conflict and the complex duality of the characters' moral paths. The soft, diffuse light within the Jedi library suggests an archaic, artificial dreamscape, a visual metaphor for the stagnating knowledge that has become disconnected from the living world. By contrast, the harsh, unforgiving light on Crait highlights the gritty, immediate reality of the rebellion, stripping away the polish of myth to reveal the tired, desperate humanity beneath the armor. The integration of these technical elements facilitates a seamless transition from the performative to the vulnerable. The camera's tendency to hold on a character's face during moments of silence allows for an exploration of the internal state that exceeds the limitations of dialogue. This reliance on visual storytelling ensures that the film's central philosophical arguments regarding the failure of dogmatic institutions are felt through the image itself. The camera's movement, always searching, always orbiting, functions as a quest for perspective, mirroring the character's own search for a reality that exists outside the confines of inherited narratives. Ultimately, the craft in The Last Jedi operates as a sophisticated mechanism for dismantling the facade of the hero's journey, using the camera to reclaim the humanity of individuals who have been reduced to mere symbols of a failing, monolithic order. The visual language asserts that truth is not found in the grand spectacle, but in the specific, quiet, and often painful moments of self-realization captured within the frame. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. The technical execution of The Last Jedi serves as a bridge between the tactile heritage of practical creature effects and a sophisticated, modern approach to digital integration. The film prioritizes an aesthetic of weight and texture, ensuring that the collision between synthetic environments and human performance feels anchored in a cohesive physical reality. By meticulously matching the color temperatures and light wraps of physical sets with CG extensions, the production maintains a consistent visual fidelity that avoids the disjointed, floating sensation often found in high-density digital environments. This synthesis is particularly evident in the depiction of the Crait surface, where the contrast between the white salt crust and the deep red mineral beneath dictates a specific, grounded lighting logic that digital elements must obey to achieve presence. The film treats digital objects with a profound respect for Newtonian physics. When vehicles collide with the terrain or machinery falters under fire, the animation prioritizes inertia and mass over the frantic, weightless kineticism typical of the genre. The walkers on Crait exhibit a heavy, rhythmic cadence that creates a sense of dread, grounding the spectacle in the limitations of the machinery itself. This commitment to physical gravity extends to the film's invisible VFX, which occupy the periphery of the frame to expand the sense of scale. Through extensive set extensions and subtle sky replacements, the film creates a world that feels vast and populated without drawing undue attention to the digital canvas. The layering of these effects is so seamless that the viewer experiences them as environmental context rather than visual artifice, allowing the characters to inhabit their surroundings as if they are tangible, lived-in spaces. The film's approach to the uncanny valley reflects a strategic use of technology to enhance performance rather than replace it. Digital creatures are rendered with an emphasis on biological micro-movements, the twitching of an ear, the uneven respiration of a creature, or the shifting of weight during moments of stillness. By embedding these subtle behaviors into the digital model, the film imbues its non-human entities with an internal life that feels consistent with the practical puppetry used elsewhere. The eyes of these digital beings retain a sense of depth through careful attention to light refraction, avoiding the flat, lifeless quality that often signals artificiality. This integration ensures that the dialogue between human protagonists and these beings remains emotionally coherent, as the digital characters respond to the actors with believable, reactive timing. The economic aesthetic of the film is defined by a dedication to high-end global illumination and complex surface textures, which provide a premium, grounded feel to every frame. The visual team avoids the flat lighting trap by ensuring that digital elements are subject to the same light sources as the actors on set, maintaining a high dynamic range that mimics the behavior of physical film stock. This level of craftsmanship signifies a deliberate choice to prioritize immersion over raw, excessive spectacle. By rooting the most fantastic elements of the story in a rigorous adherence to light, shadow, and physical impact, the film creates a visual language where the boundary between the synthetic and the organic is effectively dissolved. This technical discipline transforms the film into a tactile experience, where the weight of a metallic ship, the shifting of red dust, and the subtle flickers of an alien expression all contribute to a singular, cohesive reality that invites the audience to accept the screen as a window rather than a projection. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. Star Wars: The Last Jedi utilizes a sophisticated sonic and rhythmic architecture to dissolve the boundaries between its cosmic scale and the intimate, fractured psyches of its protagonists. The film achieves its most profound emotional gravity not through grand orchestration, but through the strategic manipulation of silence and the precise calibration of diegetic environmental sound. The sonic landscape functions as an extension of the internal states of Rey and Kylo Ren, shifting from the overwhelming industrial roar of military machinery to an unnerving, hyper-focused auditory isolation that reflects their mutual existential crisis. The film frequently employs the silence of the void as a weapon of narrative punctuation. During the film's most critical climax, the hyperspace jump that shears the supremacy in two, the sound mix abruptly vanishes, replacing the expected cacophony of destruction with a vacuum of pure, terrifying stillness. This absence of sound forces the viewer to process the sheer scale of the event not as a spectacle, but as a cataclysmic transformation of reality. By stripping away the score, the film emphasizes the sudden, irreparable rupture in the established order. This silence serves as a bridge, transitioning the audience from the noisy, repetitive propaganda of war into a state of cognitive clarity where the old narrative structures can no longer exist. The film further blurs the line between score and diegetic noise, particularly in the sequences on Ahch-To and within the Force-Bond telepathic links. John Williams' score often bleeds into the ambient sounds of the environment, where the mournful winds of the island resonate with the same tonal frequency as the low-end brass of the theme. This synthesis suggests that the environment is not a mere backdrop, but an active participant in the character's psychological reckoning. When Rey reaches out to the Force, the background noise, the crashing waves, the rustling stone, the tactile friction of the island is muted, shifting the focus entirely to the internal rhythm of her breathing and the hum of the Force. This spatial audio perspective creates an illusion of intimacy that isolates the characters even when they are surrounded by the vastness of the galaxy. Editing and rhythm are meticulously paced to mirror the volatility of the characters' identities. During the throne room confrontation, the editing patterns tighten, moving from wide, observational compositions to frantic, tactile close-ups that emphasize the physicality of combat. The rhythmic cuts are synced to the percussive impact of lightsabers, creating a sensory feedback loop that makes the violence feel dangerous and unscripted. This erratic pacing disrupts the polished, synchronized movement of traditional cinematic conflict, reflecting the psychological instability of the participants. As the characters grapple with the collapse of their respective dogmas, the rhythm of the film mirrors their lack of footing. There is no steady, predictable tempo when the underlying philosophy of their reality is being systematically dismantled. The film's auditory environment is a reflection of the post-truth state the protagonists inhabit. The loud, overwhelming machinery of the First Order and the Resistance serves as a sonic representation of their respective propaganda engines, the noise of history, order, and rigid hierarchy. In contrast, the quiet, organic spaces where characters undergo their transformation function as the site of truth. By alternating between the high-volume sensory overload of space combat and the terrifying silence of personal revelation, The Last Jedi forces the viewer to experience the exhaustion of living within a collapsing myth. Ultimately, the craft of sound and rhythm in the film serves to validate the internal struggle over the external spectacle. The technical choices do not merely support the action, they define the threshold between the performance of duty and the authenticity of self. By modulating the sonic intensity of the world based on the characters' proximity to their own truths, the film creates a sensory map of their emotional evolution. The final sequence on the Falcon, marked by a return to a more stable, grounded sonic atmosphere, provides the necessary catharsis, not because the conflict has ended, but because the silence of the protagonists is now one of resolved, autonomous purpose. The sonic architecture ensures that the audience does not merely watch the deconstruction of a legendary narrative, but hears the fundamental shifts in the characters' psyches as they move beyond the influence of the masters they were taught to obey. Synthesis of craft. The craft of The Last Jedi functions as a deliberate orchestration of visual dissonance, forcing the viewer to confront the decay of mythic archetypes through specific, tactile choices in cinematography and lighting. The film rejects the polished, frictionless aesthetic often associated with high-budget franchise cinema, opting instead for a visual language that emphasizes the weight, grime, and physical reality of its environment. This is achieved through a consistent application of anamorphic lens choices that prioritize intimacy over spectacle. By utilizing shallow depth of field, the camera isolates characters like Luke Skywalker and Kylo Ren within vast, cavernous spaces, stripping away the comfort of the ensemble and forcing an unavoidable focus on the raw, often agonizing psychological shifts occurring in real time. The lens choice serves as a narrative anchor, ensuring that the grand, cosmic stakes of the conflict are always subordinate to the fragile, individual interiority of the participants. The technical handling of light throughout the film further enforces a Jungian exploration of the character's internal duality. The cinematography employs a sophisticated chiaroscuro that actively maps the movement of the shadow within the protagonists. In the throne room sequences, the stark, high-contrast lighting is not merely a stylistic flourish, it is a visual manifestation of the characters' fractured psyches. The deep reds and suffocating blacks act as a literal and metaphorical environment that traps the characters in their own moral crises. Rather than using light to suggest heroism or clarity, the production design utilizes color as an emotional trigger, turning the environment itself into a participant in the unfolding trauma. This tactile approach to lighting extends to the CGI, where the seamless integration of practical light sources, the flickering embers of a burning library or the sterile, clinical glow of a first-order ship, ensures that the digital elements never feel detached from the material weight of the performers. The choreography of the frame reveals a mastery of the long, uncut shot, which serves to lock the audience into a state of heightened tension. By eschewing rapid, disorienting cuts in favor of sweeping, sustained camera movements, the film forces the viewer to inhabit the geography of the set. This lack of editorial interruption suggests a refusal to provide an escape hatch from the gravity of a scene. When the camera glides across the salt flats of Crait, it emphasizes the absolute insignificance of the individual against an encroaching, relentless system. The visual scale serves to diminish the human element, yet the camera's slow, deliberate focus on the character's exhaustion confirms their presence as the only tangible reality in a failing universe. The camera does not merely observe, it functions as a witness to the internal collapse of the character's fabricated egos. The film's most technically impressive moments are also its most profound philosophical interventions. The visual rupture of the hyperspace ram is perhaps the most significant technical metaphor in modern science fiction cinema, functioning as an aesthetic destruction of the genre's standard operational reality. The frame drops to total silence, stripping away the non-diegetic score and the expected noise of combat. This moment represents a complete prioritization of visual impact over traditional narrative rhythm. By removing the audio, the film forces the viewer to process the sheer visual scale of the destruction in a vacuum, underscoring the absolute, devastating consequence of the character's choice. It is a moment where the craft, the sound design, the visual composition, and the editing rhythm converges to prove that the old rules of engagement have been rendered obsolete. This synthesis of craft ensures that the film remains grounded in the physical experience of its subjects. The decision to retain a slight, filmic texture throughout the digital capture process emphasizes that these characters are not moving through a sanitized simulation, but through a world defined by its capacity to sustain and inflict damage. Every frame is saturated with the artifacts of its own reality, the dust on a tunic, the rust on a console, the uneven lighting in a damp cave. By centering the technical execution on the messy, tangible consequences of action, the film affirms that the burden of choice is a visceral, bodily experience. The legacy of this technical approach is a commitment to the idea that the medium's power lies not in its ability to generate endless spectacles, but in its ability to hold a lens to the raw, unpolished, and inherently human process of confronting one's own limitations. The craft serves the philosophy, turning the screen into a mirror of existential truth rather than a window into a frictionless, heroic fantasy. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. The legacy of The Last Jedi resides in its insistence that myth-making is an active, ongoing labor rather than a static inheritance. The film operates as a necessary deconstruction of the cyclical nature of cinematic iconography, positing that the value of a legacy lies in its capacity to inspire new, unscripted futures. By the time the final frames unfold, the film has successfully dismantled the rigid adherence to hereditary power and ancestral destiny, replacing those structures with the democratization of agency. This shift is encapsulated in the recursive imagery of the film's beginning and end. The opening sequence finds the resistance desperate, trapped, and waiting for a legendary figure to arrive, while the closing moments feature a young, unknown servant utilizing the Force not as a birthright, but as a catalyst for hope. The transition from the distant, inaccessible myth of Luke Skywalker to the tangible, pervasive spark of rebellion among the nameless reinforces the thesis that the individual's potential is independent of their origins. This evolution is fundamentally a reflection of contemporary anxieties regarding the obsolescence of grand narratives. In a socio-political climate defined by the fragmentation of singular truths, the film mirrors the struggle to identify objective meaning when the old institutions, the Jedi Order, the Republic, the binary morality of the past, prove insufficient to address the complexities of a modern conflict. The film effectively navigates this post-truth tension by stripping away the veneer of untouchable archetypes. When Luke stares into the horizon of Ahch-To, he represents the stagnation of a system that has become too beholden to its own history. The film argues that the survival of the spirit requires the destruction of these calcified idols. This is not an act of erasure, but an act of liberation, allowing the Force to transcend the boundaries of bloodlines and become a universal instrument of egalitarian potential. Technically, the film utilizes the craft of visual spectacle to ground these heavy philosophical shifts. The deliberate use of high-contrast color palettes, particularly the jarring, blood-red salt of Crait, serves as a visceral visual metaphor for the violent friction between the old regime and the nascent reality. The cinematography intentionally places characters in vast, overwhelming spaces to emphasize the insignificance of traditional power hierarchies, while the VFX work seamlessly integrates the synthetic with the organic to create a world that feels both expansive and precariously fragile. The technical risks taken in the film's third act, moving away from traditional battle choreography toward a focus on the psychic connection between Rey and Kylo Ren, prioritize internal emotional stakes over external kinetic spectacle, cementing the film's identity as a psychological portrait. The film leaves behind an unresolved, open-ended structure that serves as its greatest strength. By refusing to provide a neat, final resolution to the political fallout or the internal struggles of its core characters, the narrative invites the audience to participate in the ongoing process of meaning-making. The absence of a clean, definitive end is a tactical decision that prevents the audience from treating the story as a closed chapter, instead framing it as a living, breathing foundation for future growth. The final shot of the boy on Canto Bight serves as the definitive image of the film, capturing the exact moment a myth transitions from a distant memory to an immediate inspiration. Ultimately, The Last Jedi demands that the viewer discard the comfort of preordained destinies in favor of the precarious, necessary act of self-creation. The film moves with an existential confidence, suggesting that while the burdens of the past are heavy, they are also entirely malleable. It asserts that history is not a cage, but a library of lessons, and that true power is found in the courage to walk away from what has failed so that something genuine can grow in its place. The legacy of this work is the recognition that the cycle of violence and expectation is only as permanent as our desire to perpetuate it. It leaves the viewer not with the satisfaction of a complete story, but with the challenging, dynamic spark of responsibility for what comes next.